In my travels as an explorer and a biologist, I've been inspired by many people who are working tirelessly to better our world. In this series, I'm seeing how their vision is helping drive change and protect the planet, and what each of us can do to make a real difference. Phillip Lymbery is Global CEO of Compassion in World Farming. He's an award-winning author, a passionate naturalist, and above all, an animal advocate. He's fought his whole life for the rights of animals and to ensure that the way we produce and consume our food is both sustainable and ethical. Phillip Lymbery, welcome to ChangeMakers.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
Your extraordinary career has taken you absolutely all over the world, but to begin with, I'm going to bring us back to the UK. I read somewhere that your interest in nature was first piqued when you had a bout of chickenpox and your mother kept you entertained with a copy of the Observer Guide for Birds. Is that apocryphal, or is that really your gateway into nature?
Yeah, that's where it really started. That book and that moment enabled me to see things in the garden, living creatures that I'd never noticed before and certainly couldn't put a name to. And suddenly I was seeing, house sparrows and robins and a goldfinch, and it was just amazing. To see the living world and to appreciate it. And that really inspired a lifetime of fascination with animals and the natural world.
Birds are often a bellwether, the canary in the coal mine, pardon the pun, for our treatment of the natural world. I read an article recently which described that around 247 million fewer house sparrows now live in Europe than did when I was born only 40 years ago. What has caused that extraordinary decline?
Well, a big factor in the decline of birds over so much of our countryside is the way that farming has been going since the Second World War. In recent decades, it's gotten particularly worse. Industrial agriculture, which means that animals are removed from the land. They're put into factory farms where they're caged, crammed and confined. Their feed is grown elsewhere, and crops generally are grown using vast monocultures of single crops produced using chemical pesticides and fertilizers. And what this does is it means that farming gets bigger. And as the fields get bigger, then the trees, the bushes and the hedges, they all disappear as the chemicals then come in. So the insects disappear, and so do the weeds that are necessary for producing seeds. And so all the food and the habitat is gone for the birds, the bats, the bees, and just about everything else, leaving us with this crop, which, when it comes to factory farming, we then take and feed to the farmed animals. And in this way, we waste enough food globally to feed an extra 4 billion people on the planet. Pretty extraordinary. How is it that the way that we produce our food is so unsustainable and so damaging, and yet no one's really talking about it? It's the hot potato. Policymakers don't want to clash with the farming industry and with the food industry. And so they've long ducked the issue. But the fact is that in Britain, 70% of our entire land surface is agricultural. So if you start farming that intensively in a way which pushes nature out of the way, then you're bound to see huge declines. Globally, half the habitable land surface of the planet is producing our food. And of that, 4/5, so the vast majority, is devoted to livestock, either directly or indirectly. So when factory farming sweeps in, wildlife is swept out. In 2017, you wrote the book, The Dead Zone, Where the Wild Things Were, which described the massive negative impact that farming has had on wildlife. How was that book received? I think it was received very well. I think it gave people a really easy read entry point into what farming does to the countryside and how keeping animals locked up in cages and confinement may look like a space-saving idea, but actually isn't, because you then have to devote vast acreages of arable land elsewhere, often gained through deforestation, to feed those animals. So it really is a false economy, and it's one which is driving so much of the concerns that we have as humanity, the climate, the collapse of nature, and the health emergencies that we're now facing.
Friends of mine have dabbled in regenerative farming, and when they've done that, they've been on the receiving end of surprising levels of hostility from neighbouring farmers who seem affronted that someone might want to try something a little bit different. Have you ever felt threatened for some of your opinions?
Yeah, I received a lot of online abuse. And in the past, when we've been campaigning against live exports, we've had death threats. So there is a lot of hostility if you try to change things, to go against the status quo. And certainly pioneering farmers, regenerative and agroecological farmers that I've spoken to have a similar experience to the one that you've mentioned, which is that their neighbours are looking in, criticising and feeling criticised.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And hoping that it all goes pear-shaped. Well,
yeah.
But of course it doesn't, because farming in a nature-friendly, animal welfare-friendly way is good for everyone. It produces better food, it produces a better environment, it brings wildlife flooding back. The animals, the farmed animals, are able to experience the joy of life. So everything benefits, and it starts to revitalise the countryside. So I think what's good is that this message is now getting through, and more farmers are deciding to be pioneers for a better future. Fantastic.
These days it seems like farmers are often pitted against conservation.
Yeah.
And that farmers are no longer seen as the stewards of the countryside, but as the destroyers of it. How can we reunite farmers with conservation?
Well, I think the first thing to recognise is it's not the fault of individual farmers. Farmers and farming have been encouraged by decades of policy decisions by governments and subsidies and so on, since the middle of the last century, to go down the route of intensification. And that is why we've gotten to this situation where the majority of our farmed animals are factory farmed, where the majority of our countryside has seen a shocking loss in biodiversity, birds disappearing, butterflies and so on. And that is why the quality of our food has started to diminish too. What I think that we need to do is get behind the good farmers that are doing good things and enable them to spread the word. So get governments, companies, subsidies, finance behind this new regenerative way that can really help to secure a future for us all.
Because after World War II, it was all about dig for Britain, and now we need a new mantra to get the farmers doing something for Britain again. Is it replant for Britain, regrow for Britain, whatever it is, we need something to get behind.
Exactly, regenerate the countryside. Let's regenerate the countryside by getting animals back on the land, fewer of them. We've got far too many farmed animals in the world, but fewer of them, but back on the land where they can be part of a nature-friendly, rotational farming system, where they're moving around the farm in harmony with crop rotations, or just simply moving around the pastures so that you've got some pastures fallow whilst others are being utilised. This is a fantastic way of producing the very best, most nutritious food in a triple win situation. A win for animal welfare, a win for nature conservation, a win for consumers. Fantastic.
Win-win, win.
Exactly.
Now you are the CEO of Compassion in World Farming, who aim to have a positive and a meaningful impact on the lives of farmed animals. You've described factory farming as the biggest source of cruelty in the world, but it begs the question for me, should any animals be farmed?
That's a great question. Firstly, 80 billion farmed animals on land alone are produced for food every year. at least 2/3 of them are in these factory farms where they're essentially confined and fed grain. So they're a diversion of people food, if you like, soya, cereals and so on, that could be feeding people. But should there be animals farmed at all? Actually, I think the easier question is, have we got too many farmed animals? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. If we are going to stay within sustainable limits, within planetary boundaries, in terms of climate, biodiversity, pollution, and looking after the soil, then we've really got to do something to reduce the number of animals that we farm every year. We've got to reduce those animals by more than half. And we've got to do it very quickly. Otherwise, the lofty goals that the world has set itself, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, will be out of reach.
Obviously, here in the West, we consume too much food. I think that's obvious to everyone. But it sounds from what you're saying as though food wastage is actually more of the problem than overconsumption.
Well, I think the key thing is that in the West, we eat too much meat and dairy. Yeah. That's a big problem. Remember that the livestock sector alone globally is responsible for more greenhouse gases than the direct emissions of all the world's planes, trains and cars put together.
It's pretty extraordinary.
It's huge. Added to that, the way that we produce farmed animals is a major driver, if not the major driver, of the destruction of nature. And also keeping animals in factory farms, in these hideous confinement systems, is also the perfect breeding ground for disease. Putting lots of animals in a small space, often in filthy conditions, is a great way to help new and more dangerous viruses emerge, and to mean that you have to feed a lot of antibiotics into the system to ward off the diseases. And that is why 2/3 or more of all the world's antibiotics are fed to farmed animals.
Crazy.
Largely because of factory farming. And right there is the next pandemic. Because if we carry on as we are, we will sleepwalk into a post-antibiotic era where currently treatable diseases could once again kill.
Extraordinary. Which makes it astonishing that there's not more regulation around this. Why is that? Is it that governments are just not getting their act together? Is it because of active lobbying from the food industry? Is it some combination? What's happening?
A big part of the answer to your question is vested interests. The meat and livestock industry is huge. The meat industry alone is $1 trillion industry globally. $1 trillion, massive. So we really have to push hard to get change, but time is running out. The way that we are the industrial agriculture of animals and the associated crop production is not only the biggest cause of animal cruelty on the planet, it is also a major driver of wildlife declines. It fans the flames of climate change, and then there are these health risks too. So time is running out. We've got to get food on the agenda of climate talks, of biodiversity talks, and of food security talks. And in particular, meat has to be on the agenda because that's the big one. That's the big drain. But at the same time, there are some interesting things coming along. People are getting more and more open to the idea of alternative proteins, be they plant-based or even cell-based meat that is grown in a bioreactor from cells taken using a harmless biopsy. So, I do think that there are some innovations and some new attitudes that are at play that are coming just in time.
Over the course of your career, you have had some great wins, some big wins. Can you talk me through some of the things that you're most proud of, some of the achievements you've had?
Well, I think the biggest win to date is perhaps the most recent, which is getting the European Union, the European Commission, to announce that it's going to legislate to ban the use of all cages for animals farmed for food across the European Union. Now, what we did was mobilised a great movement to get a huge petition what they call a European Citizens Initiative, a legally prescribed petition to call for an end to the cage age in farming. And the Commission has said that they're going to see that through, which will be massive, but we need to make sure it happens. And that is why we've got to keep the pressure up. But some of the other things that are happening, the UK government has promised to end live animal exports, finally, after a 30, 40-year campaign. We've seen veal crates, tiny crates for calves. We've seen those banned in the UK and Europe. We've seen barren battery cages, the very worst systems for hens. We've seen that banned as well. So yes, we've seen some great progress. And on top of that, we've seen corporations get involved. Compassion in World Farming has worked with more than 1,000 companies alone to make commitments to lift their baseline standards for animals. So give animals a better life by taking caged eggs off the shelves, or by giving their chickens a better life. And we can tot that up. And our work over the last 10, 12 years has resulted in corporate commitments that will benefit more than 2 billion animals a year with better lives.
Yeah, that's enormous. Then there's the health impacts as well. If they're less stressed, then they're less likely to need antibiotics, and they're less likely to be shedding viruses. So the knock-on impacts on humanity is huge. But I don't think you should get away from the fact that that's billions more happy animals than would have otherwise existed, and that's something to be proud of, surely.
Exactly. And what has brought that about? People power. People who care have gotten behind the campaigns by Compassion in World Farming and others, and they're making change happen.
Phillip Lymbery, thank you for joining us on ChangeMakers. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
A real pleasure. Thank you.